for like the 5 of you, wow, 5, who are subscribed to me, know this is not my normal setup because here, go on, Goose, go on. Now wait. Good boy, good boy. You good? You hydrated? Yeah. Good boy. What was that, like 30 seconds? Right when I started pressing record. Anyway, yes, this is not my normal setup. And I was just about to explain that even though I have terrible audio quality, even I couldn't handle the noise that's going on downstairs between Goose and the laundry machine. And of course, Goose just chose that moment to guzzle his entire water bowl. But you know, dogs got what gotta do what a dog's gotta do. There he is. Hi, Goose. So, still couldn't completely reduce the noise. Obviously, Goose is still gonna walk around, but you know what? He's a rescue, he's served his time, and he gets to do whatever he wants now, okay? So if you wanna complain about the audio, don't blame Goose. He's a sweet, sweet boy. Blame me for not being willing to wait until my microphone comes in the mail. So this video, I'm realizing now, is not gonna have visual components. It's not gonna be very edited or polished. I know I'm usually creating cinematic art, but this video is definitely just the kind of thing you probably would rather listen to while you're cleaning your room or something, or doing something more important than listening to me ramble. So just a forewarning, not the most visually exciting thing, but if you're like me and you prefer to look at things in the background, this is definitely a good video for that. Anyways, something I feel like I don't really get a chance to talk about with a lot of people because it's hard not to talk about without sounding really obnoxious, is I've spent a lot of my life really focused on like environmentalism and like just trying to find a way to like justify taking up space on this planet without like destroying every possible resource we have left, you know? That's fine. And if you're not really into looking like deep into sustainability, or you're not really comfortable talking about these things, I totally understand, because like climate anxiety is a real thing. And I hate to be like that vegan or like that like dirty hippie who like looks down on other people for how they live their lives. I'm not to like talk about it unless I'm specifically asked. But it just so happened, well, I wasn't asked, but I decided to talk about it anyways. So I am in law school, some unknown reason. How well that's going, your guess is as good as mine. But anyways, something you have to do in law school is you have to write a lot of papers. Turns out law school is actually kind of hard. Yeah, they don't tell you that. Anyways, I was in a corporate accountability class, and part of my law school requirement was writing an extended research paper, we're talking like 40 to 50 pages, on basically whatever topic we want, as long as it's answering some sort of legal question. And so what I chose to focus on was corporate accountability and the zero waste movement, because I, like probably a lot of you, fell deep into the vegan tube of 2016 and then deep into the zero waste tube of like 2019 to like early 2020. It's generally like something I'm really interested in and I don't get the chance to talk about without sounding like a douche. But there was a lot of stuff I had to cut out of my paper because unfortunately I am in law school, and my professor said that too much of it wasn't really like legal in nature and didn't really make sense with the rest of the paper, but I still wanted to be able to talk about it. And that part of the paper was really like my thoughts on the zero waste like influencer sphere, and just like the way environmentalism gets talked about in like social media and like pop culture amongst young people, you know? And so I thought I'd take the chance to put my paper to use, to put all of this like grueling research I did into something besides like my grade and my graduation and my law degree, and just like share some of the things that I found with you. How's that sound? So like with any good environmental discussion, let's start with the basics. Me, and how it relates to me. So I became a vegetarian when I was like 14 or 15. And that was mostly, I would say, for like ED reasons, not particularly for any ethical reason. I think I was just like curious about like trying it, and also just didn't have the greatest relationship with food at the time. Definitely like didn't even know what zero waste was or even contemplating that. But I think like any young person, like I care about the planet, like unless you're like a Republican or something. Like I feel like most people are like at least a little bit concerned about the environment, but it's not something that like takes up space in your brain maybe every single day, you know? So I was vegetarian basically throughout the last half of high school, and then I started to become fully vegan once I moved out on my own and was going to college. And that's a complicated history, me and veganism, which is not really relevant to this video, maybe some other time. Maybe unsurprisingly, I had a lot of issues with food and mental health and stuff. But if you ask me my diet today, I am like 99.9% vegan. Like I don't buy meat or dairy. This right here is a fine Monster White Energy. But one of the things I learned through, unfortunately, a lot of therapy and a lot of just like self-reflection is that having the label of vegan, or really like any label around my food, was just like way too much for my pea brain to handle. It's just better for me to not feel bound to like any particular set of principles. If someone offers me a cupcake, I'm gonna eat the cupcake. Zero waste, also a complicated story, but a different story. So let's get into that, shall we? I think like everybody growing up, I was taught to reduce, reuse, recycle, and that our planet was like not doing so hot. And when I was younger, I was always like, I think extra interested in the earth and the environment, because I was always just like a little witchy fairy core kid, right? God, I'm 23. I need to stop. 2019, one of my friends was going on a semester abroad to Paris, and I was asking her if she had like started packing all of her stuff, and she told me it was her goal to fit an entire semester's worth of clothes and like supplies and like all the stuff she would need to move to Europe for 6 months into one suitcase. And I was like, why would you do such a thing? And she told me that she had gotten really into minimalism lately. And this is when like I feel like Marie Kondo and the spark and joy thing was like really getting into the public consciousness as well. And so that lingered with me, and so I decided to hop on a little Google, hop on YouTube, and see what this minimalism was all about. And it wasn't long before I made the leap from minimalism to zero waste. Now, what is zero waste? I feel like I've said that phrase like 10 times already and haven't explained it yet. So for those of you who don't know, zero waste has a lot of different meanings across different areas and different groups. But the Zero Waste International Alliance defines it as
the conservation of all resources by means of responsible production, consumption, reuse, and recovery of products, packaging, and materials without burning and with no discharges to land, water, or air that threaten the environment or human health.
A lot of people describe our current system as a cradle-to-grave approach when we are creating products and using products in our daily lives. We make something, we use it, we throw it away, right? And the Zero Waste movement is trying to implement a cradle-to-cradle system where we're making things, using them, and then reusing them or repurposing them to serve another purpose. And all along that chain, all of the little like waste that we're throwing away, the scraps that we're not using, the goods we're using to transport these things, are all also being accounted for. And it's important to acknowledge that the zero waste movement, although the sort of environmental movement I'm talking about sort of got that name and that identity starting in the 1980s, the practice of like being connected to the land and having just a more circular system is nothing new. And it was largely practiced by indigenous cultures in Native America and like by different communities across the world all throughout history. And the reason why we've moved away from those practices in large part is because of colonialism and because of white people. And I would be remiss to not mention that the zero waste movement, seemingly from the 1980s and certainly now, is a movement of overwhelmingly like white, sometimes queer, but typically just like white, cis women. That'll also just be like a big footnote I'm placing here. In 2019, I started to see zero waste influencers, and I started to look up ways that I could become zero waste myself. And I will take you on a tour of some of the things that I have in my home that I still use. Let me take you on a tour, show off, all right? First of all, this is a bad example because these are all clothes I took from my boyfriend and not my clothes. But I have pretty much stopped buying clothes new. I guess this technically counts as zero waste because it's my boyfriend's clothes. But I pretty much exclusively go to thrift stores for my clothes now, which is definitely not the only way to be ethical or sustainable when buying clothes. When I do buy new, I buy from brands like Girlfriend Collective or, Girlfriend Collective is pretty much the only brand that I'm like super willing to like tie my name to. Honestly, like I'm a poor law student, so like thrifting is really like how I get around. And I try to thrift like a lot of my plant pots around here. A lot of the furniture you'll see in this house is like secondhand from our parents. A lot of the like zero waste practices is also just like not having a lot of money and trying to like repurpose things that our parents gave us, right? But I'll also show you some of the more, I feel like typical zero waste things. So they're looking pretty sad right now, but these are my herbs that I grew from seeds, and they were outside for the summer, but I brought them in like a little bit too late, and so they're kind of dying right now. But I do grow my own, like some of my own vegetables, herbs, fruit when I can, especially in the spring and summer. I haven't really had a lot of success with my winter goods, but my partner's parents is always bringing me like vegetables and stuff that they've grown, which I'm very lucky to have access to as well. Yes, here we go. You are not a zero waste influencer if you don't have glass jars. These were thrifted, and I don't have access to flour and bulk bins. I get them from like paper bags and put them in here just for like aesthetic purposes. But I do compost the paper that I get, and then the sugar I am able to get in a bulk jar. So I don't have a store with bulk bins like super close to me. It's like 20 minutes away, but I'll try and make a stop there like maybe once a month just to like supply up on bulk things when I can. And I also live with people, so you'll see lots of not zero waste things from them as well. Here, more aesthetic mason jars and stuff, and then some of my partner's thing, but also like things in plastic, like this. This is mine. This is plastic. This is definitely not zero waste, but you know, I want to be clear. I definitely did not give up everything, and I'll get into that more. I do not buy sponges anymore. This is a wooden and Castile soap that I got from Earth Hero, and then I get all of my soaps from Blue Land, which is a really cool company that does like refillable pods for all sorts of different types of cleaning supplies. I also gave up paper towels in 2019, but my roommates and my partner still desperately cling on to them, despite me telling them that they don't need to. Coffee also got in bulk jars, and I used the French press to deal with it. I do also have reusable K-cups, but I honestly haven't used this Keurig in a very long time. It's mostly my roommates now. And my biggest source of waste is right here. My sweet boy. Yes. Goose is not zero waste. No. He is thrifted. He is definitely the thing I buy the most like new packed and packaged things for. And you know, we make sacrifices for him because we love him. Continuing the tour of my zero waste lifestyle, this is my pet axolotl Dart, who I got for free from somebody who had 2 axolotls who accidentally had baby axolotls. So her tank is not thrifted. Her tank I bought new, but I do use her tank water as fertilizer water for my plants. Oh, she's so cute. And the worms I buy for her do come in a styrofoam container, but I use the grounds that they come in, again, to fertilize my plants. And I have tried so hard to have like live plants in here instead of plastic plants, but I have never gotten it to work successfully without having like major algae blooms and just messing with her tank and like her vitals. So I try not to mess with her too much. Hi, cutie. Hi. Then we have my gecko Ryuk's tank. I got Ryuk off of Craigslist because I am also not super into buying from Petco if I can avoid it. He has a combination of the plastic leaves that I got like a really long time ago at this point, and then live plants. And like there used to be a lot more live plants, but honestly like the pothos has just like taken over, and Ryuk loves it. I would show you him, but he does not like to be touched and it's the daytime, so we're gonna respect his boundaries. And I use compostable cups to feed him in, and I am planning on switching over to just like reusing kombucha lids and potentially just like washing them and reusing them, or if I can find like a little metal like saucer thing to like wash and reuse, that's kind of like what I want to move towards, because I buy the compostable things off of Amazon and they still come in plastic, and it's like compostable things still have an impact on the environment. So I'm trying to phase that out. The laundry machine is on, but I have to show you the most important thing any zero waster has: the tub of empty jars. Like, I honestly, like, looking at this, I can't believe I had to come out to my partner as if this wasn't just like a giant pride flag, you know? You are not a zero waster without just infinite supply of recycled materials. So, toilet paper from Who Gives a Crap, which is a really great sustainable toilet paper company. We do have a bidet in our upstairs bathroom. Yeah, and then outside I have my compost bin, and like I said, I try to pretty much be vegan and like eat locally and like thrift and not buy too much. Do XYZ to not pollute the planet, right? I'm by no means perfect, and I'm like nothing compared to like zero waste influencers for sure. So that's just like some context for this conversation. So getting back to the story, in 2020, my New Year's resolution was actually to permanently cut out single-use plastic like in my life, which like I did not have Goose at the time, but I was like not going to buy any more single-use plastic, and that meant no more vegan chicken nuggets. I was trying to think of other examples, but honestly like the vegan chicken nuggets, oh, and the sunflower butter, those would be like the two biggest sacrifices, but like it's a significant sacrifice, right? That was my goal for 2020, and as you can imagine, I did not meet that goal because I don't know if like you noticed, but like people started acting like really weird in March of 2020, and all of a sudden I was not able to use the bulk bins. I was not able to even use like my reusable tote bags. I had to buy a lot of disposable medical supplies, and I had to get them fast, so I got them from Amazon, and I didn't really consider like who the supplier was or what the impact of that purchase was, because I was looking out for like my safety and my family's safety and like the people around me, right? Like that was my only priority. I imagine that was your only priority. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. There's like, here I was, like this one person trying to fix like the wave of plastic pollution affecting the entire globe, just like independently. Saw companies continuing to push single-use plastic as like the sanitary option. Different plastic companies asked for bailouts from the government. They asked for exemptions to keep producing in their factories in exchange for producing masks along with the other products that they were already going to make anyways. Just the pandemic really showed me all the different ways that the corporations were capable of just like exploiting a crisis. And I was like, why was the zero waste movement presented to me, and why did I instinctively interpret it as something that was my responsibility, something that individuals were supposed to do? And the truth of the matter is, companies made it that way. They have spent decades pushing the environmental crisis onto individuals. They have spent decades providing misinformation. Not only makes it seem as though it's the individual's fault for the environmental crisis, but that the companies are doing everything they can to actively remedy the harms that individuals are causing. So going into my CERP paper, that was the topic. So my actual paper, which I'm turning in, is called Trash Talk: The Toxic Relationship Between Corporations and Zero Waste in the Zero Waste Movement. So in case you didn't know, the United States has a trash problem. The world has a trash problem. Each day, natural resources are extracted, manufactured, brought out before briefly being thrown away, either to be put in a landfill or incinerated, or otherwise just out into the ecosystem. And the US in particular produces 33% of the planet's waste, even though we make up only 4.6 of the world's population. It's actually suggested by several of these studies that if every person on the planet lived like the typical American, we would need 5 planet Earths to keep up with all of the waste and resources that we use on a daily basis. So growing up, we were taught to do what we could, reduce, reuse, recycle, reduce our carbon footprint, bike to work, turn off your lights, all of these like little tasks to just like build up to enough to save the planet. And more zealous environmentalists who were more policy driven even went to zero waste, so individuals were drastically cutting their impact to as close to zero as they physically could. Zero waste is a misnomer. It's not something that can be achieved by a human being. A significant amount of people were growing interest in this way of living. And directly in contrast to that, corporations were diluting their environmental responsibility across every consumer basis. They were self-regulating, derailing, and deflecting the environmental conversation, and cherry-picking the crisis so that they could never be held accountable, never produce meaningful change, never change the status quo. And the status quo is capitalism, because capitalism is the root of all problems, but that's one sentence and not 40 pages, so that didn't meet the law school graduation requirements. So the modern zero waste movement began in the 1980s, and it's most often attributed to a man named David Knapp. He's a UC Berkeley grad, and he started, I guess you would consider a scrap business, where he would sort through materials that were typically being sent to landfill, repurpose and resell them with the intention of diverting as much waste as possible from the landfills. And his work ended up picking up a lot of steam. By the 1990s, we saw different environmental organizations being formed specifically about zero waste. One of the first being No Waste by 2010. And then in 2000, Georgia State Senator Donzella James was the first state senator to introduce zero waste legislation. Legislation has since been adopted by 20 other states, and Donzella James actually continues to promote different environmental laws in Georgia State, and she seems like a really great lady. But if you have heard of zero waste, you're probably not thinking about these early policy movements. You're probably thinking about the sort of 2010 to now aesthetics of zero waste. This era was when we saw zero waste move away from policymakers and go directly into the homes of individuals. Bea Johnson is someone you may associate with zero waste. She's sometimes seen as the inventor of the modern zero waste movement. In 2010, her home was featured in an article in the New York Times showing how she practiced zero waste in her home. And then in 2013, she released her book titled Zero Waste Home: The Ultimate Guide to Simplifying Your Life by Reducing Your Waste. I haven't actually read her book. I'm not sure if she specifically brought the mason jar aesthetic that made up just like so many 2013 weddings, but it's certainly been a byproduct of her work. Lauren Singer is another woman you may have heard of. She was the one who came up with the waste in a jar challenge, where she would put any non-recyclable waste she produced. That sounds weird. Any non-recyclable waste that you can throw away into it. And it was meant to show how difficult it is for individuals to reduce their waste meaningfully. But it was also meant as a challenge for individuals to try their best to fit it into a jar. And I guess I don't have reasons to doubt her. I don't have reasons to doubt her for like her being able to fit things into a jar. But I know for myself, even if I like truly gave up all the things that I like enjoyed, I would not be able to do this. Does Lauren Singer not have pets? Because like I have to give Goose Frontline and heartworm medication, and those all come in like little thin plastic tabs. And some of the medicines I use also come in like thin plastic things that I can't really do anything about. And like a lot of places now have email receipts, or you can just like not take the receipt, I guess, but some places just like give you a receipt, and like what are you gonna do with a receipt? You can't recycle a receipt. If you guys didn't know, it's a different kind of paper. Like it could be possible. I think Lauren Singer runs some sort of like zero waste store on top of like living in her home. So she probably did have access to like certain goods that maybe members of the general public wouldn't have been able to. But regardless, a feat. And I think overwhelmingly, like if you were to ask someone what they knew about the zero waste movement, it would be like those pictures of people with their jars. Another major movement within the zero waste movement is the single straw crisis, which I'm sure you all also remember in 2018. So I don't know if Zucky Zuck was just feeling a little spicy one day. One day in 2018, just Facebook's algorithm was just filled with this one really devastating video of a sea turtle with plastic straws poking out of its nose. And people, many for the first time, were becoming viscerally upset with the idea of, with just the sheer amount of plastic straws that are produced and disposed of every single day can harm conveniently cute animals we care about, like sea turtles. Different states and cities passed bans on plastic straws and encouraged different restaurants to start including paper straws or not including straws at all. That's less typical. McDonald's actually began passing out flyers about how environmentally sustainable they are and how they were going to be switching to paper straws. So they were producing mass amounts of paper to inform you how they were not going to be wasteful by using plastic straws. You can not like paper straws, you can like plastic straws. Again, I'm not gonna fight you about these things. Each of them have their pros and cons. Starbucks also announced their greener alternative to the plastic straw, which was a plastic lid, which was sort of a sippy cup form. And for what it's worth, some brands did talk about how they would begin phasing out some of their disposables, and particularly their plastic disposables. But in hindsight, we can see that there are a lot of problems with this idea. First of all, something a lot of people didn't think about was how this would impact people with different mobility issues, generally like disabilities. Straight up metal straws are not a reasonable alternative for people who can't control their muscles very well. Having to advocate particularly for their continued access to plastic straws placed people with disabilities in a very weird position where they had to go against what seemed to be like the morally right thing to do or the environmentally correct thing to do. People with disabilities just were not considered in a lot of these different corporate moves. But also, plastic straws just aren't the problem that we thought that they were in 2018. Of the 11 million tons of plastic dumped in the year, I think plastic straws make up less than 0.025%. Most of the plastic that we see in the ocean comes from packaging, industrial waste, and fishing. And not only that, but the controversy around plastic straws caused the market for paper straws, silicone straws, and metal straws to skyrocket. And although in a lot of ways, I would say most ways, choosing these materials over a single-use plastic is a better option. But no product is without its environmental footprint. No product is without some sort of impact. And despite there being plenty of reusable water bottles, despite some people not even using straws to begin with, a lot of people were suddenly buying metal straws or paper straws in their home just because it was something they were thinking about at the time, not because they actually needed to replace the plastic straws that they were using. Steely said they sold more than 1 million metal straws in 2019, and that number has drastically fallen off since. Also, the reusable water bottle market just skyrocketed at that time. And to personally tell you that I have received like at least 4 reusable water bottles from like just different events that I've gone to. It's like the first like freebie that any place will give you. We all have reusable water bottles, and we all lose them at some point because it's not necessarily something we find valuable. They're very easy to access and repurchase over and over again. When the zero waste movement became about individuals, when it fell into this free market, it became something of like a symbol, something to show that you were wealthy enough, educated enough, ethical enough, mason jars filled with bulk goods to get the trendiest thrifted clothes from Depop. And a lot of the more nuanced or less like visually appealing aspects of zero waste were just completely removed from the conversation. I remember in 2019 when I was looking at zero waste influencers and some of the recommendations they were making to implement in their zero waste lifestyle. There's one content creator I found, and I'm not gonna name this person, I don't remember who they are anyways, but they listed some of the things that they had given up for their zero waste lifestyle and that they recommended other people give up. So they said not to use any sort of streaming service or cable because the energy used to produce the electricity and sort of send the signal so you can stream these services has an environmental impact, and you should reduce that. So she recommended buying DVDs, secondhand of course, and using again a thrifted DVD player, but to not do that too much because also using your TV generates electricity, and that's also causing an environmental impact, and we want to avoid that. Same with Spotify or any sort of like music streaming. So she had a record player and a huge amount of records that she would use, and she's like, see, there you go. And if you want to buy new records, sucks to suck. I do have a record collection, but I also very proudly use Spotify, and if that's my worst environmental impact, I am fine with that. But it gets even better. She keeps going. So since you can't listen to music anymore and you can only watch so many DVDs and listen to so many record players, instead of that, you can read only thrifted secondhand books, of course, but also, you know, just like sit and reflect on like your environmental impact. So like her suggestion was just like to lay in a fit of despair about the state of the world, and that would be a great way to lower your carbon footprint. And it would. And gosh darn it, I do spend a lot of my time laying on the floor, just getting some real eco-anxiety. But that's not the best thing I can do for the planet. I would say the best thing I can do for the planet is donating to organizations I trust to advocate for meaningful change. And I certainly don't recommend to any of you that just like sitting on the ground and giving up anything that gives you joy is the best way to go about environmentalism. Sometimes it still feels like a 50-50 chance of whether I'm going to see an environmental advocate or whether I'm going to see someone who genuinely has good intention, genuinely wants to make the planet better, but has sort of approached zero waste from this very problematic individualist framework that really like taints the movement. So the theory I have, and the theory I discuss in my paper as to why I had such a hard time finding these inclusive zero waste advocates, is because of the way that companies have sort of molded the discussion around environmentalism. Even though we may not realize they are often puppeteering a lot of the conversations around environmentalism, and often puppeteering the conversations around holding them accountable, which is not a great sign as far as holding them accountable. And so if you're like me and you carry the weight of your eco-anxiety on your shoulders, I'm here to tell you that it's not your fault that a lot of very smart people dedicated millions of dollars to marketing misinformation to us. And I'll just go through some of the most, what I found, upsetting versions of it, and that I included in my paper. So corporate actors today operate with minimal restrictions on what they can produce, distribute, waste, and they have very minimal liability for their environmental damage. And this is in part because the consumer market, the Industrial Revolution, outpaced legislators in terms of being able to regulate. Things were being marketed to consumers at an exponential rate during the 1920s to 1960s, and the Environmental Protection Agency wasn't there. We didn't have a lot of the sort of core tenets of US environmental laws at that time, and we didn't quite comprehend the full extent of the damage companies were starting to do at that time. So starting in the 1920s, companies started pushing plastic as this new miracle substance. And in a lot of ways, plastic was the miracle substance. It's flexible, it's light, it helps keep food and other perishable materials from expiring. Plastic was a big hit with companies and consumers alike. But because there was so much plastic and we had so much unfettered access to it, we didn't hesitate to throw it away after often the single use of the plastic. And contrary to other materials like wood or paper, plastic does not just disintegrate into a harmless material. Plastic, when it starts to break down into the environment, can release toxins into the surrounding environment, into the ground that it may be in, into the air, into our water system. And it's honestly yet unclear how much of a health impact plastic leaching chemicals just like into different parts of the atmosphere has had on like human long-term health. There's a lot of different intervening factors there, so it's hard to say with certainty. But plastic refining is one of the fastest growing and largest manufacturing sectors in the world today. Emissions from just one of the proposed new plastic refineries is the equivalent of 400,000 cars on the road. And so by the 1990s, consumers were reasonably pretty upset with the effect that plastic pollution was starting to have. And so companies very quickly needed to come up with a solution to sort of scapegoat their liability. And so they found the perfect one: recycling. Internal documents from the time that have since been leaked show that many head executives in the time never saw recycling as a viable long-term solution to the climate crisis, but they continued to push it. Why did they continue to push it? Well, for one, recycling is a very easy visual concept to get. When you see a plastic bottle on the ground, for one, it's visual. You can see its direct environmental impact. And if you're told that this item will, instead of being placed into the environment, be repurposed into another product, that just seems like problem solved, right? And if recycling was a perfectly operating system, it would be. But only 9% of all the plastic that has been created up until this point has been recycled. Recycling in the 90s and today just cannot operate at the scale that we would need it to, and companies were fully aware of this at the time. Not to mention that for each one garbage can that a person puts on the curb, you're seeing 70 garbage cans being made upstream by companies. And despite all of this, companies started rapidly engaging in marketing to sort of save their image and push recycling as a problem for the consumer to solve. You started seeing a lot of ads referring to people as litter bugs, a lot of different anti-littering campaigns. Keep America Beautiful in the 1970s released this glorious advertisement called the Crying Indian campaign. Not the name I would refer to, but the ad depicts a Native American person. I also believe the actor was not a Native American person, because of course they weren't. But it depicts a Native American person sort of stereotypically dressed, riding in a canoe down a like city river, surrounded by like pollution and smog, and then a like crumpled up food wrapper is thrown at the Native American's feet, and you just see like a dramatic single tear. And the ad ends with saying, "People started pollution, people can stop it." It's absurd. It's absurd. And this kind of marketing, even though it probably has gotten a lot more subtle over the past couple of years, it's still there. In 2019, Coca-Cola suggested that don't buy Coca-Cola if you don't help us recycle. Industry of Uruguay once said, "It's not plastic, it's you." The overwhelming focus of these companies was on public education, encouraging the proper disposal of plastics and other materials as the most effective way to reduce harm, especially to marine pollution, which was a big concern at the time and is still today. So while an individual could be potentially fined and jailed for littering, companies were not directly liable for the waste that a consumer was suddenly burdened with when they were purchasing their product. Another common tactic that was used by companies was just sort of the out of sight, out of mind mentality of pointing the finger at East Asian countries. So this way, people in the US especially could continue to fill their recycling bins, and just with the belief that these materials were actually being recycled and reused in US goods. And from the 1980s just up until 2018, vast majority of what was placed in our recycling bins were being shipped and sold to China, and this accommodates for roughly half of the world's plastic waste. 2018, China decided that they would no longer be engaging in this sort of waste economy. By the way, 60% of the waste that was being brought over to these East Asian countries were coming from 10 companies. So anyways, when China decided they were no longer going to be buying these goods, Thailand and other companies surrounding China saw huge rises in their plastic trade. A lot of these countries simply do not have the infrastructure to support major sorting and redistribution that is required to manage all of this waste. And especially now with China being removed from the situation, there physically is not enough space for the US to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing all of this waste over to these countries. And ultimately, it's starting to impact the US and the space that we have on this side of the planet. Another term you've likely come across just growing up and going about your daily life is the term carbon footprint, which, if you didn't know, was actually developed by the great British Petroleum. Yes, in the early 2000s, BP hired a marketing company and assigned them with the task of coming up with a ploy to push the environmental crisis onto consumers and away from major oil companies. And this group of executives came up with the term carbon footprint. If you go to the EPA's website now, you can see a carbon footprint calculator. The New York Times has published ways you can reduce your carbon footprint. There's a great article, which I reference in my paper, written by Mark Kaufman, called The Carbon Footprint Scam, which is where I initially discovered this information, was able to get a lot of research. So people were being told to reduce their carbon footprint by, like I mentioned earlier, turning off their lights, riding their bikes, showering in cold water, all these sort of minute things that would just sort of take away the convenience of daily life, you could say. Never in that conversation was there any sort of discussion about how we could remove ourselves from the oil and gas that was fueling all these different activities. It's easy to say, don't take your car to work, but if your job is 20 miles away, you don't really have a say in that conversation. But these inconsistencies didn't really matter because for all that BP knew, people were never going to be confined to their homes, not moving, not engaging in daily life, right? So in March of 2020, no one was flying, no one was driving. For those first couple weeks, a lot of people were just sort of living off of the food that they had in their freezers and the dried goods that they had. A lot of people lost their jobs, so they weren't even producing waste in that sense. They weren't generating productivity for a company either. And despite all of that, despite this drastic reduction in individual activity, the carbon emissions rate only reduced by 8% from 2020 to 2019. And in fact, in May of 2020, we actually saw a peak of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Why? Because the pandemic did not stop large oil companies from continuing to make oil deposits. They were still collecting and selling petroleum because there was no economic benefit for BP or any other large oil company to do so. They never intended to reduce their carbon footprint, and probably they never realistically expected individuals to reduce them either. And we now have pretty clear, demonstrable evidence that it wouldn't have made a difference. And reading through this section, especially in my research, I really started to question what my role is as an individual who cares about the environment, who tries to engage in activity that has a minimal impact. And I still stand by the belief that individuals should strive for change, should strive to reduce their impact in their daily lives. Or at least that I should, even if not other people. And it's less because I think individuals are capable of making the major change that is needed to reverse the climate crisis. It's more so because I feel it would be ethically at odds or just like hypocritical for me to be demanding change from companies and not making any moves to make changes on my own either. And I just generally prefer to have a lifestyle that reflects my ethical and moral values. But that's my one viewpoint. Yeah, so if any of you guys have any idea how I can solve the climate crisis all on my own, feel free to drop a comment. Oh, but it's not the only way that companies sort of deflect any sort of responsibility. Another popular tactic they use are voluntary commitments. And I actually dedicated an entire section of my paper just to the different voluntary commitments that companies will use, because it's no longer the norm for companies to not care about the environment, at least like publicly. Companies nowadays at least have to give off the illusion that they. So some of these commitments are put forth by individual brands, and others are sort of alliances of big companies, such as the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, which have invested more than $1 billion into preventing plastic pollution, which is great. Unfortunately, the Alliance has also invested $186 billion in 2010 and 2017 into new petrochemical production plants. So plastic pollution. So they're like donating to like compete against themselves and not even trying that hard. So unfortunately for me, because a bitch does love Diet Coke, Coca-Cola is one of the worst and like one of the most flagrant plastic polluters. For one thing, setting lofty goals, saying that they're going to eliminate plastic waste or reduce the amount of carbon that they're producing is great, but there's really no way to hold them legally accountable to any sort of measure. Coca-Cola has pledged on numerous occasions to increase the amount of recycled plastic in their bottles. As early as 1990, they said that their bottles would be 25% plastic within like 15 years. They said it again in 2005, in 2010. All this time, they were never giving progress reports, and to this day, they only have, I think, an estimated 10% recycled plastic materials in there. And a lot of these voluntary commitments actions by companies are overwhelmingly focused on waste. One area that I was really unaware of was the waste picker industry. So Unilever once said that waste picking is actually a great way to create jobs for marginalized communities in India. Deleted the article referring to it. Nothing about like limiting production, nothing about limiting toxic materials, nothing about paying for some of the damage they've already caused, nothing like that. Again, on these things that the consumer has already been taught about how we need to get rid of the waste that we can see, and if we get rid of the waste that we can see, then everything is fine. And when there are talks of regulation that could potentially hold these accountable as liable, you will see a noticeable spike in pledges to voluntary commit, because voluntary commitments are a great way to show legislators that they don't need to be policed, that they're already holding themselves accountable, that they are capable of regulation without bureaucracy. And it is so much easier to just like imagine that they are capable of doing things on their own and holding themselves accountable, but they are not financially invested in holding themselves accountable. I keep saying that there's no financial incentive for these companies to change. And what I mean by that is we currently operate in a capitalist society, and this isn't just a capitalist communist thing, but we operate in a market system where companies do not have to consider the economic impact of their production or of their service when they produce something. They are just accountable up until the product gets sold. After that, for the most part, companies aren't really liable for what. And so for a fossil fuel company, investing in high-risk carbon deposits over green energy isn't just like a choice, it's an obligation to generate profit to their shareholders. For instance, in 2009, Shell announced that their oil reserves had dipped to 95% instead of the 100% replacement rate. And so in an effort to assure their shareholders that they weren't losing out on oil, they immediately cut funding to some of their wind and clean energy projects and majorly doubled down on risky oil deposits. So just in 2010, they were able to triple the amount of oil they had produced to a reserve ratio of 288%. And this kept their stock from going down. And I go into a lot more specifics and other tactics that companies use in my legal research paper, but spoilers, I guess, you'll have to read the whole thing, but also I feel like it's not super interesting to you all, maybe it is, but companies have succeeded in this marketing. A survey from 2017 found that 43% of people still thought individuals had the most impact on resolving the climate crisis. And then it went to government, nonprofit, and corporations in last place. So only 17% of Americans thought that corporations were in the best position to resolve the climate crisis. It's just factually incorrect. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 50 of them are corporations. The overwhelming majority of carbon emissions that are in the atmosphere today come from companies and not individuals. The overwhelming amount of plastic pollution, of marine pollution, of any sort of toxicity that is in our environment right now comes from companies, and it comes from a very small group of companies. I'm not talking about small businesses. I'm talking about like Fortune 500 major companies that you all know and probably rely on in your daily lives. And that's not a shame to you. It's something I do too, because we really don't have any way of exiting participation the way it is. So we can either sit on the floor in a state of despair and save our resources that way, or we can advocate for meaningful change that will allow these companies to be regulated in their totality the way that they always should have been. We really need to move past this like individual zero waste mind frame that companies have encouraged us to approach things from and look into things as a collective. And my paper goes into various different legal metrics that could be used to hold people accountable. I think the best illustration of it is the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which has been introduced several times in the US Senate over the years. It's been introduced in 2021. It is unlikely to pass, but it is a law that does a lot of things. But importantly, this law targets companies from a multitude of different angles to reduce their impact on the climate. This includes caps on new plastic being created and put into the atmosphere. Companies being levied fees are now financially responsible for the cleanup and recycling of these products. The law also incentivizes behavior by companies that makes it easier to repair and reuse products that are being made. It sets bans on a lot of the harmful materials that are currently being used in particularly plastic that make it, one, difficult to recycle and harmful. And it's not a perfect solution by any means. Oh, hi, Goose. It's not a perfect solution by any means, but it's certainly a start. I hope that anytime you see a company branding themselves as environmentally conscientious, you approach that with skepticism, and most importantly, you vote locally, in your state, in your elections, in a way that reflects these meaningful changes, because this is truly the only way that thing has come around. And there's a reason you'll often hear about like the Green New Deal. It's because like really like the last time that the US was successful in holding companies accountable while making major social changes was the New Deal. That was when companies were subject to heavy regulation, heavy fines, while massive investment was made into public infrastructure, public jobs, focusing on American individuals rather than these companies. It changed the US economy in a lot of different ways. And we are still capable of that. We are still capable of meaningful change. Do not feel like the environmental crisis is your responsibility, but do not feel like it's something that's impossible to solve either. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. I'll be linking my paper in the description below, which will have a lot more specific information, and most importantly, it will have the sources that I used for the things that I said, because I did not come up with these statistics myself. I did not specifically conduct peer-reviewed studies. Other great genius people did, and I will have to credit them. If you want to give that a read, I definitely recommend it. Hopefully my professor likes it as well. Do not critique me on the writing style, because at that point I have already turned it in. I cannot change it, and I will cry. I definitely am not an environmental expert, policy expert. I'm just someone who's like passionate about this stuff, and tries my best to like be a good human for the planet. So anyways, thank you for listening to that. I hope you enjoyed it for what it's worth. I'll also be linking the great Shell Bizzle, because she truly is the person that like keeps me invested in like environmental activism and is just a great content creator. So yeah, stick around if you want. I'll keep uploading videos as long as I keep having an existential crisis about what I'm doing with my career. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you around.